For 35 years, Clara wasn't allowed to open the old barn behind her house. Her husband forbade it, and she never asked why. But after his death, a single key changed everything, and what she found inside revealed a love and a grief she never knew. Stay with me to the end, like and subscribe if you believe some doors open only when the heart is ready. The road to Maryvale stretched endlessly under the Kansas sun, pale and shimmering with heat. Clara Hayes leaned her forehead against the truck window as the landscape unfolded miles of wheat fields rippling like an ocean of gold, and beyond them, a lone house standing against the horizon. Samuel had called it home the first time he showed her the photograph, a weathered farmhouse with a slanted porch and a red barn behind it, the kind of place people passed without a second glance. Now, as the truck rattled down the gravel road, she wondered if she'd made a mistake leaving everything behind. The noise, the people, the heartbeat of Kansas City for this. Samuel drove in silence, his sun-worn face steady, the kind of stillness that could comfort or distance. When they finally pulled into the drive, the tires kicked up a soft cloud of dust that shimmered in the dying light. The house looked older than in the picture paint, peeling from the siding porch boards, sagging slightly. A mailbox that leaned as if exhausted by the wind. Yet there was something honest about it, something unpolished and true. Samuel got out first, his boots crunching the gravel. "Well," he said simply, "here we are." Clara stepped out slowly, her shoes sinking into the soft earth. The air smelled of grass and rain far away. Cicadas hummed from the fields, their song rising and falling like breathing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence, just heavy, the kind of silence that seemed to settle into the bones of the place itself. The house smelled of dust and pine soap, its rooms asleep under white sheets. Samuel moved through the rooms with quiet familiarity, brushing his fingers along door frames, opening windows that had long been sealed shut. Clara followed behind, feeling both like an intruder and a bride, stepping into a life already half-lived. "It'll need work," Samuel said, pulling one of the sheets away from the old couch. Dust rose like ghosts, but it's ours now. She smiled faintly, though something inside her hesitated at the word ours. That night they ate sandwiches on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the fields. The light softened the hard lines of Samuel's face, made him look almost boyish for a moment. Clara thought about the years ahead, the quiet mornings, the long evenings, the sense of building something from scratch. Maybe this was what she had been chasing all along, a slower life, something real. When the first stars appeared, Samuel pointed toward the barn. "Don't go in there," he said, not unkindly, but with a weight she didn't expect. "It's not safe yet. The floor's weak nails sticking out everywhere. I'll fix it up soon." She nodded, though her gaze lingered on the outline of the barn, tall, dark, a little crooked, like it had secrets of its own. Later, after he had gone inside, Clara stayed on the porch. The wind moved through the wheat in long, shushing waves. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. She let the sound wash over her, the loneliness of it seeping quietly into her chest. Inside, Samuel moved about the kitchen, the faint clink of dishes marking his presence. When he came to bed, he kissed her temple, quick, habitual, and fell asleep almost immediately. But Clara couldn't. Her eyes kept drifting toward the window, toward that dark shape in the backyard. Around midnight, she heard it, a faint melodic hum, almost like a lullaby coming from the barn. It stopped as soon as she sat up. The night returned to its deep breathing silence. She waited, heart pounding, but it didn't come again. Maybe it was the wind, she told herself. Maybe it was just her mind trying to fill the empty spaces. Still, when she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of a door she wasn't meant to open, and the soft, rhythmic creak of something rocking gently in the dark. The days slipped into rhythm before Clara even noticed. Mornings began with the sound of Samuel's boots on the porch, the screen door creaking as he stepped out into the Kansas sun. He always left early, his lunch pail in one hand, a thermos in the other, nodding to her with that quiet steadiness she'd come to depend on. She would watch from the kitchen window, as his truck disappeared down the dirt road, a small cloud of dust trailing behind. When the house fell into stillness, every tick grew too loud, so Clara filled the hours with cleaning and reading. The pipes groaned when the water ran. The floors sighed when she crossed them. Sometimes she played the old piano in the living room softly, just to prove the silence didn't own her. In the afternoons, she walked the edge of the property through the wheat that brushed her fingertips. She liked to imagine roots growing beneath her feet, holding her steady. But part of her knew she still floated somewhere between two worlds, the one she'd left behind and the one she hadn't yet grown into. Evenings were easier. Samuel always came home by 6, smelling of oil and dust. He'd wash his hands at the sink, roll up his sleeves, and ask what was for dinner. His tone simple, practical. They ate together on the porch when the weather was kind, saying little but sharing quiet looks that felt almost like conversation. He had a way of listening even when no words were spoken. Sometimes when the wind moved just right, she'd see the barn door sway slightly on its hinges. "It needs fixing," Samuel would say without looking up from his plate. But he never fixed it. Clara tried to ignore how often her eyes wandered toward it, drawn by something she couldn't name. One Friday after a long week at the library, she came home to find Samuel sitting on the steps, a half-empty beer bottle beside him. It wasn't unusual he liked 1 or 2 after work, but that night, his eyes were softer, distant. He handed her the bottle with a small smile. "Sit a while," he said. She did. The air was cool, smelling of wet soil and summer grass. The fields glowed faintly in the moonlight. For a while, neither spoke. Then, out of nowhere, he said quietly, "If there's ever someone in that barn, don't be afraid." Clara blinked, thinking she'd misheard. What she asked, half laughing, half nervous. But he didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed on the dark shape of the barn. The beer bottle caught the light when he lifted it again, his knuckles pale. "It's just old wood," he murmured finally. "Old places remember things." Later that night, he fell asleep quickly, his breathing deep and even. But Clara lay awake long after. His words echoed inside her, circling without rest. If there's someone in that barn, what kind of thing was that to say? She told herself he'd had too much to drink. Maybe it was nothing. But the next morning when she looked at him over coffee, she saw that same unreadable calm, the one that didn't invite questions. She didn't ask. After that, she started noticing his habits. On nights when the rain rolled in from the west, Samuel would stand out on the porch facing the barn, sometimes for hours. He wouldn't move, just stand there under the dripping eaves, water soaking through his shirt, until he looked carved from the storm itself. Once, she stepped out to bring him an umbrella, but he shook his head. "It's fine," he said, voice barely above the rain. "Go back inside." When she turned away, she thought she heard him whisper something low and steady, like a prayer or a promise. Clara stopped asking where his mind went on those nights. Instead, she tried to anchor herself in small things, baking bread, arranging wild flowers in chipped vases, reading by the lamp while thunder cracked far off. But even then, the sound of rain on the roof began to carry a new meaning. The rhythm of a man standing outside guarding something she wasn't allowed to see. There were moments when she almost asked him why. Once, while folding laundry, she said his name softly just to start. He looked up from the table, patient, waiting. But the question caught in her throat. If I ask, he'll tell me something I can't unhear, she thought. So instead she smiled and said, "Do you want another cup of coffee?" He nodded, and that was that. The house remained peaceful on the surface, a still pond reflecting the sky. But beneath it, something moved quiet, unseen, waiting. The first spring in Merivale came soft and green, the wheat pushing through the soil like tiny prayers. That was when Clara found out she was pregnant. It happened quietly, almost shyly, as if life itself didn't want to draw too much attention. She told Samuel one evening after dinner, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her glass. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he stood, crossed the room, and pulled her close. His chest felt solid and safe, his breath uneven. "We'll take care of everything," he said finally. "Everything's going to be all right." From that day on, the house changed. Samuel built shelves for baby books. He repaired the old rocking chair that had belonged to his mother. He even painted their spare room a gentle shade of blue, though he never said why he chose that color. Clara watched him work the sound of his hammer steady and sure, and felt something bloom inside her that had nothing to do with the baby. It was hope. Fragile but alive. Every night they sat together on the porch, talking about the future. Samuel wanted a boy who would follow him to the garage, who would learn how to fix things. Clara imagined a girl with her father's eyes and his quiet kindness. They didn't say it aloud, but both of them began to believe the baby would heal. Something between them would fill the spaces that silence had built. But life, it seemed, had its own language. It happened one morning 8 weeks in. Clara woke to a sharp pain, low and deep. By the time Samuel got her to the clinic, there was nothing anyone could do. The doctor's voice was gentle, almost too gentle. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes. It wasn't viable. You need rest. Try to stay calm." She nodded, numb, staring at the white wall behind his shoulder. On the drive home, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the windshield wipers brushing away a thin drizzle back and forth, like the rhythm of something ending. That night Samuel held her while she cried, until there were no tears left. He whispered, "It'll be all right," again and again, until the words lost meaning and became just sounds, a heartbeat that wasn't there anymore. In the days that followed, the house grew smaller. Samuel took down the blue curtains. The rocking chair disappeared from the corner. The paint cans went back into the shed. They never talked about the baby again. The silence became a wall between them, built not from anger, but from mercy. Sometimes in her weaker moments, she would imagine a tiny hand curling around her finger, a cry echoing through the hallway, the smell of warm skin and milk. But she pushed those thoughts away before they could settle. One late afternoon, while the wind moved lazily across the fields, Clara saw Samuel in the backyard. He was carrying a small wooden box, something he'd made from the scraps in his workshop. She watched from the kitchen window as he walked to the far edge of the property near the tree line. He knelt down, dug into the earth with his hands, and lowered the box into the ground. No ceremony, no words, just a man burying something he couldn't keep. She wanted to go to him to ask what he was doing, but something held her back. The air between them was still too fragile. That night his hand smelled faintly of soil when he touched her. Years passed, and the memory of that day faded, like old wallpaper not gone, just hidden under layers of time. They grew older together, careful with their words. Every anniversary came and went with the same quiet tenderness, as if love had learned to walk on tiptoe. Then one rainy Sunday morning, nearly a decade later, Clara was searching for extra blankets in Samuel's dresser when she found it a frame wrapped in an old flannel shirt. Inside was a black and white image, the outline of something small and precious suspended in shadow, a sonogram. Her throat tightened as she realized what it was. She carried it downstairs, the air thick in her chest. "Samuel," she said softly, placing it on the table. "Why do you still have this?" He looked at the picture for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he said, "It's nothing, not anyone's, just something I kept." His voice was flat, final. She wanted to argue, to demand honesty, but the way he looked at her, tired, gentle, afraid, stopped her. She picked up the frame, her hands shaking, and put it back where she found it. The rest of the day passed like fog. That night, as she lay beside him, she stared at the ceiling and realized she could hear his heartbeat clearly, slow and steady, like a drum keeping time for two people who had run out of words. The years crept by like slow rain, steady and unremarkable at first, then impossible to ignore. Time softened the sharp edges of grief, but it also hollowed something inside Clara that never quite filled again. She stopped counting months, stopped hoping for late mornings or quiet surprises. The doctors had been kind, but clear another pregnancy wasn't likely. Her body had decided its own fate, and she made peace with it in the only way she knew how, quietly, without ceremony. Samuel never spoke of it. He nodded at appointments, drove her home in silence, and returned to work the next day as if nothing had been said. But at night, when he thought she was asleep, she could hear the weight of it in his breathing. He still brought her coffee every morning, still fixed the leaky faucet before she even mentioned it. But something in him had shifted. The steadiness she once loved began to feel like distance. He spent longer hours in the garage or out back near the barn. Sometimes when the house was too still, she'd hear him talking softly out there. Low murmurs, the rise and fall of his voice like he was answering someone. The first time she heard it, she froze in the hallway holding her breath. He wasn't on the phone. They didn't even have service that far from town. He was speaking to the dark. She wanted to step outside to ask who he was talking to, but the sound of his voice was tender, almost reverent, and it stopped her cold. It reminded her of how he used to speak to her when they were newly married, when love was still something that needed words. Eventually, she pretended not to hear. Denial was easier than fear. One night in late autumn, the moon hung low over the fields, pale as milk. Clara couldn't sleep. She stood by the window, the house quiet, except for the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Out back, she saw Samuel standing by the barn. He wasn't moving. The porch light caught his face just enough for her to see that his eyes were closed. Slowly, he leaned forward and pressed his lips against the door, as if saying goodbye to someone inside. The gesture was so intimate, so heartbreakingly gentle, that Clara's hand flew to her mouth before she could stop herself. He stayed there for a long moment, head bowed before turning and walking back to the house. When he climbed into bed beside her, his skin smelled faintly of cedar and cold air. She kept her eyes shut, her pulse thrumming like a drum. She didn't ask. The next morning she rose before him and stepped outside to shake off the unease that had lingered all night. The dew was thick, soaking her slippers, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and hay. As she reached the porch steps, she stopped. Sitting right at the foot of the door was a small stuffed bear, soft beige with a red ribbon around its neck. Its fur glistened with morning dew. She bent to pick it up, confused. The tag was still attached, the edges crisp and clean. It was brand new. She turned toward the yard, half expecting to see a neighbor, a child passing by, but the field stretched empty in every direction. When Samuel came down for breakfast, she held it up. "Did you put this here?" she asked. He looked at it briefly, expression unreadable. "Maybe it blew in," he said. "Wind can carry strange things." His tone was calm, almost casual, but something flickered in his eyes, not guilt exactly, but recognition. She set the bear on the counter and didn't press him. They ate in silence, the scrape of forks against plates louder than usual. Afterward, she found the bear moved to the mantel, perfectly upright, as if someone had placed it there with care. For days, she couldn't stop seeing it. Every time she walked past, it seemed to watch her, not with malice, but with a kind of quiet knowing. At night, she would lie in bed listening to the soft groans of the old house, the whisper of the wind outside. And somewhere beyond that, the faint sound of wood shifting, maybe the barn door, maybe something else. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that every marriage had its silences, its private corners, but deep down she felt it, the presence of something between them, invisible, but undeniably there. It wasn't another woman. She knew that much. It was something older, deeper, something that had been growing quietly since the day they buried the box behind the trees. Sometimes she caught Samuel watching the horizon with that same faraway look he'd had at the clinic years ago, the one that said he was somewhere she couldn't follow. She wanted to reach him to pull him back, but didn't know how to cross the distance without breaking both of them. The nights grew longer. The wheat turned silver under frost. And still he went out to the barn, his flashlight cutting brief, trembling lines through the dark. Winter came early that year, a thin frost spreading across the windows before Thanksgiving. The mornings grew slower, the coffee colder before it reached the table. Samuel had been coughing for weeks, brushing it off as dust from the garage, but there was a weariness in him that Clara hadn't seen before. One afternoon, she drove into town with lunch for him, something she rarely did. The garage smelled of oil and iron, and the air buzzed with the clatter of tools. She found him sitting by a truck he'd been working on. His head bowed, his hands resting on his knees. His face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Sam," she said softly, setting the lunchbox down. He He looked up as if it took effort to recognize her. Then his eyes rolled back, and he crumpled to the floor. The sound of metal hitting concrete echoed in her ears long after she screamed his name. The regional hospital in Lincoln, Kansas was cold, its walls painted in a color meant to be comforting, but wasn't. The doctor was too young to have learned how to soften bad news. "It's pancreatic cancer," he said, looking down at his clipboard. "It's advanced. I'm afraid surgery isn't an option." The words hung in the air, heavy and slow, like snow refusing to fall. Clara sat there, hands clasped, her knuckles white. Samuel stared straight ahead, expression steady, unreadable. The doctor kept talking treatments, timelines, pain management, but none of it seemed to land. When they finally stepped outside, the cold hit them like a wall. She reached for his hand. "We'll fight it," she said. "We'll do whatever they tell us." He shook his head. "No." His voice was quiet, but certain. "I don't want that." She tried to argue, but he turned to her eyes, calm, distant. "I'm tired, Clara. Let's just go home." He smiled, then that faint, uneven smile she'd fallen in love with years ago, and she knew the decision had already been made. Back at the house, everything slowed. Samuel slept more, spoke less. The tools in the garage gathered dust, and the porch swing sat still for the first time in years. Clara tried to fill the days cooking soups he barely touched, reading aloud from books he no longer followed, folding blankets he never used. The quiet grew thick around them, and every sound felt too loud. The clink of a spoon, the creak of the floor, the shallow rhythm of his breathing. One night near the end of December, she woke to find his side of the bed empty. The air was sharp and cold. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and looked out the window. A faint light flickered behind the barn. For a long moment she thought it was just the reflection of the moon. But then she saw movement, the slow, deliberate motion of a lantern swinging in his hand. She slipped on her boots and stepped out onto the porch. The wind bit at her skin. "Samuel," she called, her voice catching in the dark. He didn't answer. He stood in front of the barn door, one hand resting against it, his head bowed. She watched from a distance as he reached into his coat pocket, took something out, and pressed it to his chest. Then he disappeared inside. When he returned half an hour later, his face was pale but peaceful, his eyes softer than she'd seen in months. "You should be in bed," she whispered, helping him up the steps. He smiled faintly. "Soon." That night after he fell asleep, she checked his coat. The pockets were empty. In the morning he didn't mention it and she didn't ask. Days passed. The cold deepened. His hands grew thinner, his voice slower, as if each word cost him something. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that looked almost like guilt. What she asked one afternoon, half smiling, half afraid. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just thank you." The words were so simple they almost broke her. 2 nights later, she found an envelope tucked inside the drawer of his nightstand. The writing turned face down, the flap sealed. She ran her fingers over it, but didn't open it. Something in her told her not to. Not yet. The next morning when she brought him tea, he looked at her for a long time before speaking. "Clara," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "If I go when I go, don't open the barn." She stared at him, her breath caught. "Why?" He smiled weakly as if the question itself hurt. "Don't turn pain into answers. Some things are meant to stay closed." She shook her head, tears brimming. "You can't ask me that." He squeezed her hand, his grip still strong despite everything. "Promise me." She hesitated, the words heavy on her tongue. "I promise," she said finally, not because she believed she could keep it, but because she was too afraid of what breaking it might mean. That night the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and the house groaned, as if remembering every secret it had ever held. The morning of the funeral came gray and windless, the sky a dull sheet of cloud stretching from one horizon to the other. The fields looked lifeless without Samuel moving through them. No smoke from the garage, no hum of his truck starting before dawn. Clara stood at the kitchen window for a long time before she could make herself dress. She wore black, though Samuel had once told her he hated the color on her. The service was small, held in the old Methodist chapel on Main Street. A few men from the garage came, their hands rough, and hats clutched against their chests. Mrs. Fenton from the library brought a pie she left on the steps because she didn't know what else to do. The pastor spoke kindly, but briefly, his voice echoing against the wooden walls. He was a good man, he said. And that was true, though the word good suddenly felt too small for what she had lost. When the last dirt fell, the wind whispered through the headstones, leaving her alone. She didn't cry. Not then. The tears sat behind her ribs, waiting. When she finally returned home, the house greeted her with silence so complete, it seemed alive. Samuel's boots still stood by the door. His coffee mug waited on the counter. The blanket he used in the evenings was draped over the chair, holding the faint shape of his shoulders. She walked from room to room like a stranger. The air carried the scent of him, soap oil cedar, fading already. At sunset, she sat on the porch and watched the light crawl across the fields, the sky burning itself out in colors too beautiful to bear. When darkness came, she stayed there listening. Somewhere in the distance, a barn owl called its cry, long and hollow. On the third night after the funeral, Clara woke suddenly. The house was dark, except for the sliver of moonlight spilling across the floor. Something had stirred her, a faint, unfamiliar glow outside the window. She rose, heart thudding, and pulled back the curtain. Out by the barn, a light flickered weakly, shifting like someone moving with a lantern inside. For a long moment she stood frozen, breath shallow. Then she slipped on her coat and stepped out into the cold. The air bit her skin sharp and clean. Frost glittered on the grass as she crossed the yard, each step slow, deliberate. The light burned steady now, a thin golden thread leaking through the cracks in the barn's walls. "Samuel," she whispered, though she knew better. The wind didn't answer. When she reached the door, the glow vanished, gone in an instant, as if it had never been there. The sudden darkness felt heavier than before. She pressed her palm against the wood, cold and rough beneath her fingers. For a moment she thought she smelled something sweet, faint and unexpected, the powdery scent of baby lotion, soft and ghost-like. It lingered in the air, mingling with the smell of dust and rain. Her breath trembled. She stepped back slowly, the night closing around her. The stars above looked cruelly clear. She turned and walked toward the house, the hem of her nightgown brushing the frost. Inside, everything looked the same, yet wrong. The chair too empty, the table too neat. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the nightstand. The drawer where Samuel kept his watch was still slightly ajar, as if he had opened it last. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. She pulled it open fully. Beneath the old receipts and spare buttons lay a small envelope, its paper yellowed at the edges. Her name was written across the front in Samuel's handwriting, steady but faint. She hesitated, afraid of what it might ask of her. Then she tore the seal. Inside was a single brass key, cool against her palm, and a folded note. The words were few, written carefully. "For you when missing me doesn't hurt anymore." He had not revoked her promise. He had handed her the choice of when mercy would weigh more than pain. She stared at the sentence until the letters blurred. The house groaned softly as the wind pushed against it, a tired, familiar sound. She held the key to her chest, her fingers trembling. The weight of it was unbearable and yet somehow comforting, a heartbeat pressed into metal. Outside the barn stood dark again, silent and patient beneath the moonlight. The fields rustled faintly, like breath. Clara sat in the quiet until the first light of dawn touched the windows, the key still warm from her hand. The morning she chose to open the door. The sky was the color of ash. Clara hadn't slept. The key lay on the nightstand beside her, glinting faintly in the thin dawn light, as if waiting. She'd held it every night since finding it, turning it over in her hand like a coin she couldn't spend. For days she'd resisted. For weeks she'd told herself she wasn't ready. But that morning something inside her shifted. The house felt too quiet, too watchful. Even the wind seemed to pause outside, holding its breath. She made coffee she couldn't drink and pulled on Samuel's old sweater, still faint with his scent. The air outside was cool, damp, with mist. The grass bent beneath her feet as she crossed the yard. Each step sounded louder than it should have, as if the earth itself were listening. The barn loomed ahead, familiar and foreign all at once. Its boards were gray and splintered, its roof sloping tiredly to one side. She reached the door and stood still, the key warm now from her grip. "If I go, don't open the barn," his voice whispered through her memory, deep and steady. She closed her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered back. The lock turned with surprising ease, a soft click that made her heart lurch. The door groaned as it swung open, light spilling into a space she hadn't seen in 35 years. Fresh pine joists braced the floor, and new boards ran true where the dangerous planks had once given way. The smell hit her first dustwood, and something faintly sweet like baby powder left too long in a drawer. Her breath caught. It wasn't a barn. It wasn't anything like what she'd imagined. The inside glowed softly, as though the room itself exhaled. A white crib stood in the corner, its paint slightly cracked, but carefully cleaned. Beside it sat a small rocking chair, with a faded blanket folded neatly over the arm. The walls were covered in drawings, bright crayon sketches of smiling suns, stick figures holding hands, crooked houses under blue skies. Some were childish and uneven, others almost deliberate, like they'd been drawn by someone pretending to be a child. Across the top of one wall in Samuel's familiar handwriting were the words, "For our family." Her knees weakened. The sunlight from the open door caught on a shelf of storybooks, Goodnight Moon, The Velveteen Rabbit, and others she'd once thought about buying, but never did. A soft sound filled the air, delicate and trembling. She turned toward it. On a small wooden table by the crib sat a music box painted blue with tiny silver stars. Clara recognized the tune at once. Samuel had placed this old music box in the barn years ago, long before the pregnancy, and on certain nights he must have wound it and left it playing. Its lid was open, and the tune that drifted out made her blood run cold. It was the same melody she'd heard faintly on the night she miscarried, when Samuel had held her through the pain, whispering that everything would be all right. She hadn't realized then that he'd been humming a song. Now she knew he hadn't forgotten it. She stepped closer, her hands shaking the tune, repeating over and over in its fragile, broken rhythm. Something glimmered on the far wall, a picture frame. She moved toward it, afraid and drawn at once. Inside the frame was a sonogram, the same one she'd found years ago in his drawer, the same image she'd tried to forget. Only now, below it, written in careful letters, were words that made her knees give out, "Our child forever loved." She fell to the floor, her hands pressed against the cold wood. The air felt thick, alive, pulsing with memories that weren't supposed to have survived. The walls seemed to breathe around her. She could almost hear the faint creak of the rocking chair, the soft echo of laughter that had never existed. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered his name. Samuel. Why? But the room gave no answer. She reached for the crib, her fingers brushing the smooth edge. Inside lay a small stuffed bear, the same one she had found on the porch that morning long ago, its ribbon carefully retied and the fur kept clean despite the years. Her heart twisted so tightly she thought it might break. Every piece of the puzzle she had avoided now fit perfectly the nights he'd spent out here. The whispers she'd heard, the smell of sweetness in the air. He had built this place not for her to find, but because he couldn't let go. He had built a world for the child they lost. And in the end, he had loved them both in silence. The music box slowed its tune, faltering. She knelt there, surrounded by everything he had kept hidden, everything he had made sacred. The light shifted through the cracks, catching on the dust that swirled like faint golden ghosts. Her chest rose and fell with quiet sobs, until she had no sound left, only breath. The air was still again. Only the faint ticking of the music box remained softer, now fading like a heartbeat moving away. The room was quiet, except for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath Clara's knees. Her breath fogged faintly in the cold air, her fingers still trembling from the shock of what she had seen. On the small desk beside the crib lay a notebook, the cover worn smooth, the edges curled from years of being opened and closed. Written on the front in Samuel's careful hand were the words, "For our child, if love was enough." Her throat tightened as she reached for it. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingertips, as if it might crumble at her touch. She opened the first page slowly, afraid the words would undo her completely. The ink had faded in places, but his handwriting was unmistakable, blocky, deliberate, steady. "The day you left your mother, fainted. The doctor said we shouldn't talk about it. But I can't bury you as if you never existed. I can't live like that. So I built this room. I built it to keep you near, to remember what should have been." Clara pressed her palm against her chest, feeling her heart stumble. She read on each line, pulling her deeper into the world he had kept hidden. "I started with the crib. It took me 2 weeks. I wanted it to be strong. I didn't tell your mother. She was sleeping a lot then. I didn't want to wake her with the sound of the hammer." The next page was dated nearly a year later. "Today would have been your first birthday. I bought you something, just a small bear, soft and brown. It arrived in the mail this morning. The man at the post office asked if it was for my kid. I said yes. I couldn't say otherwise." Clara remembered the packages that had come over the years, the oddly shaped boxes, the ones he never explained. She had thought they were tools or parts for his work. Her eyes blurred as she turned the page. "Every year on your birthday, I'll bring something new. A book, a toy, something small, so that you keep growing even if you can't." Her tears fell onto the paper, darkening the ink. She could almost hear him saying the words aloud, that quiet gentleness in his voice when he spoke of things too fragile to name. Another entry dated nearly a decade later read, "Your mother has stopped asking about the barn. I think she's afraid of what's inside. Maybe she knows deep down. Maybe she just doesn't want to see how I've turned grief into ritual. But I can't stop. This room is the only place I still feel whole." The entries grew shorter over time, the handwriting shakier, the lines uneven. The last few pages were written in pencil, faint and fading. "The doctors say it's my pancreas. Funny, isn't it, how a single organ can decide when you've had enough time? I think of you every night. I still hear you in the wind. If there's a heaven, I hope you found the sunlight there." Clara closed the notebook slowly, holding it to her chest. Her body shook with silent sobs, her tears falling onto the wooden floor. She looked around the room, the toys, the books, the careful arrangement of things that had never been touched by a living child. Then she saw something in the far corner, half hidden beneath a blanket, a small wooden box, the same kind she had seen him bury behind the trees all those years ago. Her pulse quickened as she crawled toward it. Dust had settled thickly on the lid. She brushed it away, revealing Samuel's handwriting again, faintly carved into the wood, Eli Hayes. A dark, thin tide line of old soil ringed its corners, as if it had once slept beneath the trees before Samuel carried it here. Her breath caught. She opened the box with trembling hands. Inside lay a small glass jar, sealed tightly, filled with fine gray ash. Around its neck hung a thin silver chain engraved with a date the same week they had lost the baby. A folded card beneath it bore the crematory's stamp, and date the smallest official proof of a life the world never met. She couldn't move. The air thickened, pressing down on her shoulders. The name echoed in her mind, Eli. The name they had once considered for a boy, but never spoken aloud again. He had given their child a name, and he had carried that name like a prayer for 2 decades. All the nights she'd thought he was keeping secrets, he had been keeping vigil. All the silence she'd resented had been grief quiet, patient endless. Clara sat back on her heels, holding the jar in her lap, her tears falling freely now. The room felt warm suddenly, though the air was still cold. The sunlight had shifted, casting long gold bars across the floor. Dust floated through it like tiny souls rising. She looked up at the wall again, at the drawings, the colors, the life he had imagined here. And for the first time, she didn't feel haunted. She felt surrounded by love, by something deeper than time or death. Samuel had lived with ghosts not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't let their child vanish into nothing. He had built this place to prove that memory was still a form of presence. She reached for the notebook once more, tracing the words on its cover, if love was enough. Her voice broke as she whispered into the still air. It was Samuel. It was. The wind outside moved gently against the walls, almost like a breath, and the music box began to turn again slowly, the soft melody filling the room as if in answer. The afternoon light shifted softly through the cracks in the barn walls, painting the floor in quiet gold. Dust floated lazily in the air, each speck shimmering like a memory that refused to settle. Clara sat on the wooden floor beside the crib, her knees drawn to her chest, Samuel's notebook open on her lap. Hours had passed, though she hadn't noticed. Her tears had dried into faint salt trails on her cheeks, but her heart still felt raw, hollowed clean by everything she had learned. Around her, the room breathed gentle, alive, almost tender. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, and something warmer, something that felt like presence. She reached for the pencil lying beside the notebook, its end chewed and worn from Samuel's hand. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she turned to the last blank page and began to write beneath his final words. Eli, she wrote the name catching in her chest. Your father carried you in every breath he took, and now I will carry him the same way he carried you. We are still a family, even if the world forgot. The pencil shook slightly, the words uneven, but it didn't matter. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was writing into emptiness. She felt as though someone, maybe both of them, was listening. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the old music box, its melody slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat at rest. Clara closed the notebook and set it gently on the desk beside the framed sonogram. Her eyes fell on the wooden box again, the one that had held Eli's ashes. Something inside told her there was more. She lifted the box carefully, her hands steady now, and saw another envelope hidden beneath the lining. It was sealed in wax, the color deep and dark, and her name was written across it in Samuel's hand, Clara. She swallowed hard and opened it. The letter inside was short, written in uneven lines, as if his strength had been fading while he wrote. If you're reading this, my love, it means I'm gone. Don't be angry that I kept this place from you. I didn't do it to shut you out. I did it to keep what little light we had left alive. Every time I stepped inside, I felt close to him, to both of you. I needed that. It was the only way I could still feel like a father. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, a sob rising but catching halfway. She read the next lines slowly, her eyes blurring. I built this for love, not sorrow. I know you've carried enough of that for both of us, so if you ever stand here reading this, promise me you'll let it go. Don't carry what I carried. Love is heavy, Clara, but it doesn't have to hurt. Her shoulders shook as she read the final lines, the ink faint, the pressure of the pen lighter than before. The night before I left, I dreamed I heard him, our boy. He called for you. He said your name. Maybe I imagined it, but it felt real. Did you hear him too? The letter ended there, the words fading into white. Clara stared at the page, her chest aching with the weight of it. For a long time, she couldn't move. Then, as if something deep within her cracked open, she began to weep. The sound came from a place she hadn't touched in years, a place where grief and love intertwined until they were indistinguishable. She clutched the letter to her heart, rocking gently, whispering into the still air. I heard him. Sam. I heard him. Her voice broke halfway through, but she kept speaking, the words spilling out like light. He called for me, and I didn't answer then. But I hear him now. The wind outside sighed against the barn walls, brushing through the cracks like a quiet breath. The sunlight had shifted again, deepening into amber, casting a soft warmth over the room. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the world was closing in. She felt it opening slowly, gently, like a door she hadn't known was there. The air around her shimmered faintly, and for one fragile moment she thought she heard two voices intertwined, one deep and familiar, one light and new, both carried by the same breeze. She closed her eyes and smiled through her tears. It's all right, she whispered. You can rest now. The light lingered on the pages of the open letter, and the music box began to turn again on its own, the tune soft and full like a lullaby meant to be shared. A year passed, soft and steady like snow melting into spring. The seasons turned without resistance, the fields bloomed again, and the air in Merivale carried the scent of wild flowers and earth. The house no longer felt haunted. The silence that had once suffocated Clara had changed, mellowed, become something almost companionable. Each morning she woke before sunrise, brewed her coffee, and walked barefoot across the grass toward the barn. But it wasn't a barn anymore. The cracked boards had been sanded smooth, the faded red walls repainted a gentle cream. The window panes gleamed in the sunlight, catching bits of the sky. Above the door she had hung a wooden sign Samuel once carved for his workshop. She'd re-etched the letters herself, the Eli room. Inside, the space had transformed. The crib remained, but it now held stacks of books, picture books, fairy tales, old story collections from the library. The shelves Samuel had built were filled with bright covers, puzzles, and toys. The air smelled faintly of paper and lemon oil. Every morning children from the town came to read, to listen, to laugh. The sound of them filled the room like bird song. Clara sat in the old rocking chair Samuel had built, her voice warm, as she read aloud, her laughter mingling with theirs. The first time she opened the doors to them, she had felt a nervous flutter in her chest, as if inviting the world into something sacred might undo it. But instead it brought the space to life. The room that had once held grief now held light. The townspeople called it the reading room, but the children called it something else entirely, Miss Clara's place of stories. Some of them didn't know what loss was yet. Others knew it too well. She watched them all with quiet tenderness, the way Samuel might have, and thought that maybe love had found its way back, changed but still alive. One bright morning, as the children crowded around her for another story, a little boy with messy brown hair tugged at her sleeve. He couldn't have been more than 6. His eyes were curious, searching. "Miss Clara?" he asked softly. "Who's Eli?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Then she smiled the kind of smile that begins somewhere deep in the chest. "Eli," she said, closing the book gently, "was a child who taught me how to love again." The boy nodded as if he understood something wordless, then leaned his head against her arm. The moment felt infinite, a small heartbeat of peace in a life that had been filled with so much ache. When the children left that afternoon, their laughter fading across the fields, Clara lingered in the doorway, watching the light shift across the floor. The room glowed golden, warm, and alive. The wind moved gently through the open window, stirring the mobile above the crib, the wooden stars Samuel had carved. They spun slowly, catching the sunlight. She reached out and touched one. "You did well, Sam," she whispered. "You really did." That evening she stayed late to clean up. The air outside turned cool, the sky streaked with purple and orange. She stacked books, folded blankets, and set the small stuffed bear back on its shelf. When she finally turned off the lamp, the room sank into a soft darkness. She paused by the door, her hand on the light switch. For the first time in years, she felt no heaviness pressing on her chest, only quiet gratitude, only warmth. Then, just as she turned to leave, a faint sound filled the air behind her. The music box. Its lid had lifted on its own, the delicate melody spinning through the room, the same lullaby Samuel had built his grief around, the one she had once cried to in the dark. The tune was clear, gentle, alive. Clara froze, her heart stilling for a beat. The sound wrapped around her like light. She turned slowly, and in the dim glow from the window she saw it, a thin line of golden light slipping through the crack beneath the door of the small closet where Samuel had kept his tools. It wasn't bright, just soft, like the shimmer of a candle seen through tears. She didn't move toward it. She didn't need to. She understood. "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I know you're here." The air seemed to answer a shift, a sigh of feeling more than sound. She stood there for a long time, her hand pressed to her heart, listening as the music box played its final notes. When it stopped, The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of peace, full of love, full of something that had never truly left. She closed the door gently, the click soft in the dark, and stepped out into the cool night. The prairie lay vast and quiet under waking stars, the house glowing faintly against the deep blue. She stood for a moment, the wind brushing her hair, carrying with it the faintest echo of that lullaby. Then she smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "I've forgiven you, Samuel," she whispered to the wind. "And I'm still here. I'm living." The breeze lifted soft and playful, swirling around her like an embrace. She looked up, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw two figures walking side by side in the field, one tall, one small, fading into the light of the stars. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more. Which moment stayed with you, the secret in the barn or Clara's forgiveness? At the end, share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know.